we have to remember that our boundaries are for us, which means that no one has an obligation to them except the boundary setter. Hey y'all, welcome back to the podcast. Oh my gosh, it has been a day for recording. You hear me? Like, I've had the hardest time trying to get this episode recorded, but we are finally here, and let us hope, fingers crossed, that this is the episode, okay? So this episode, I want to talk about boundaries, mostly because in my experience, a lot of us do not really understand how boundaries work or even really what they are. But we need them. It's super important that we have them. And I mentioned in the last episode that we were going to talk about boundaries. And so I want to make sure that we lean into that. Let's start at the beginning with a definition. What is a boundary? Really simply put, a boundary is a limit. It is basically a rule that you set for yourself, and you will not allow anyone to cross that for whatever reason. So as an example, an alcoholic may have a boundary that says, I will meet clients for coffee, but never cocktails. Someone who, is meeting new people may have a boundary that says, I don't do hugs, but I do, lean into handshakes. Like, no hugs, I prefer handshakes could be a boundary for someone when meeting new folks. Another example could be a family may have a boundary about cell phone use or iPad use at, meal times. We are going to engage with each other as a family instead of, leaning into our devices. A boundary that I regularly exercise myself is that I refuse to engage with folks who are committed to not understanding me. It leads to a ton of frustration. There's no resolution. It can take a lot of energy. And so the moment I realize that someone is like absolutely committed to misunderstanding me, like they're just like not willing to hear the words that I am saying out of my mouth, I remove myself from the discussion. Like, boundary, not doing that. Boundaries help us keep ourselves safe. They protect our well-being. They give us a bit of framework and grounding so that we can experience our lives in the ways that are the most useful for us. One thing that's really important to remember about boundaries, though, is that they belong to you. So that means you are responsible for setting and keeping them, no one else. So if you have a boundary that says, for example, that you don't like scary movies and so you don't watch them because, maybe they give you nightmares, that means that you don't watch scary movies. It does not mean that your friends do not watch scary movies. So if your friends decide to all get together and watch scary movies one weekend and they invite you, then maybe you should elect to not go. What sometimes people think boundaries mean is that you should say to your friends, well, maybe we don't watch scary movies. Maybe what we do is watch rom-coms. Okay. And if they're friends, you can suggest that. But the wrong behavior is to expect that your friends will say, no, we're just not going to watch scary movies because you don't want to. It's your boundary. All right. It's your boundary. So you should remove yourself and perhaps not participate that weekend. When I was gluten-free, I did not expect my friends to avoid Italian restaurants or not eat pizza. I did appreciate when they thought about me when we were making dinner plans, but I made the adjustments because it was my boundary. And let me be very clear, I love it when people are thoughtful about my boundaries. So I love when someone's like, oh, I found this restaurant, it's fantastic, and they also can accommodate gluten-free. The same way if you don't do scary movies, you would love if someone was like, oh my gosh, we don't have to do scary movies. We can do rom-coms because it is thoughtful about you, and that feels really good. But we have to remember that our boundaries are for us, which means that no one has an obligation to them except the boundary setter. It's nice when people accommodate. It can make us feel loved and supported and all of those fantastic things, but no one has to, right? It doesn't have to happen. And if someone does something that happens to cross a boundary that you set, such as having a weekend where they are watching scary movies, then you adjust, all right? You adjust to make sure that your boundaries are being met. That's the first thing we need to know about boundaries. Now, what are boundaries not for? What they are not intended to do is support unhealthy or avoidant behaviors. And people use boundaries for this all the time. Okay. So I, used to date a guy who, would say to me whenever we would have a conversation that made him, even slightly uncomfortable. I have a boundary about engaging in stressful conversations. I'm just trying to live a stress-free life. And he would just like stop talking to me. Like he would end the conversation and walk away. And for people to be in relationship with one another, we have to engage in some tough conversations from time to time. Like that doesn't mean that we are, at each other's throats or arguing or fighting. It means that we are engaging in healthy conflict resolution. And it used to drive me up a wall how I could be like literally in the middle of trying to solve a problem, like a concern or address something with him. And he would just say, yeah, I have a boundary about stressful conversations, and totally walk away. Like, I don't want to talk about that. And that would be it. Total shutdown. Now, a healthy boundary might be, hey, I'm not ready to talk about this right now. Let me process my thoughts and let's talk about it tomorrow so that I can, show up a little better for the discussion. Would have been fantastic. That is never what happened. Okay, never. It was clearly avoidant behavior, and it was a misuse of what boundaries are actually for. He was essentially avoiding and using boundaries as the reason to avoid. And let's just say, I developed a boundary around dating people who are conflict avoidant. So we didn't work out. And so that's one of the things we have to be careful about, is that boundaries are not intended for you to avoid things. Okay. Another thing that boundaries are not for is passively bullying people into doing what you say. Another example, I had a leader who would routinely say things like, this team has boundaries around negativity. We don't engage in negativity. If it's negative, you need to keep it to yourself. We like to have positive energy. Very much I don't want to talk about anything bad type of leader. And so when someone would come to her for help, she would essentially say things like, this isn't very positive. Is there another way that we can discuss this? I don't really want to talk about this if it's really negative. And what would happen is that myself and other members of this team would go to other leaders, because we knew if we went to our leader with something that was perceivably quote unquote negative, we would get met with this like hyper positive, behavior that was like not realistic, because I have a concern, I have a problem. What happens is that this leader is not really setting a boundary. What they're doing is using the language of boundaries to shut down dissent, to silence, valid concerns or feedback. And it did not work out well for her. After, some time, she developed a reputation for not taking escalated calls because they were negative, right? And she framed them as team members were not being positive enough and not handling calls well. And she was eventually let go from the organization. Boundaries are not for you to avoid. Boundaries are not for you to bully your perspective onto others. All right. And people use them for that all the time. People think boundaries are about creating this perfect little comfortable bubble. They learn about boundaries and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm putting all these boundaries up so that my life feels so good all the time. Not how it works. Okay. Boundaries do not mean shutting people down or cutting them off because you are uncomfortable. All right. We've talked about this. Growth comes from discomfort. You got to be a little uncomfortable. All right. I often like to tell people, like, are you uncomfortable or are you unsafe? Because if you're unsafe, we've got to talk about that. But if you're uncomfortable, we might just need to work through that, right? And we'll talk about discomfort in another episode. But if a boundary consistently keeps someone from accountability, from growth, from meaningful connection, it's probably not really a boundary. It's the language being misused. Now, in this episode, I would love to walk you through a process of how to set boundaries. It's a thing that I teach regularly. Believe it or not, lots of senior leaders and lots of really fantastic organizations really need help with boundaries. It's a common thing. We misunderstand what this means. We don't set them well. And we think that when we set a boundary, everyone's going to adhere to it. And it takes a moment for us to realize oh, wait, it's my boundary. I've got to be the one to do it. Because sometimes our boundaries can make us sad. I really want to hang out with my friends, this weekend, but they're watching scary movies, So I've got to have my boundary. And so it is a thing that takes work and that I have to work with clients on. And so I would love to give you the tools for that, but it doesn't necessarily translate well on the podcast. So what I am going to do is if you click down into the show notes, you will find that I have a downloadable resource for you. So I've added a free downloadable guide. You don't have to do anything. You can just click it and go to the link and click download. I'm not sending you spam, but it gives you like some very simple 1, 2, 3 type steps on how you can set boundaries, things that you should be thinking about, questions you should ask yourself, because I want us to all have better boundaries. And I want us to actually know what boundaries are and what they mean, because they do help you to have the kind of life that you want. And they set the expectations that others should have around how they engage with you. One of the best examples of boundaries I've witnessed was kind of in passing, but a friend was an alcoholic, did not drink anymore, but definitely, hey, I'm an alcoholic, I cannot drink. And there was a window of time where like there were desserts that were like Jack Daniel's double chocolate cake or whatever. And this cake was amazing. And I was trying to share, oh my gosh, you've got to try this cake. It's incredible. And in my brain, I'm not thinking about like the Jack Daniel's part. I'm just like, it's an amazing chocolate cake. And so I was describing the cake, and this friend was like, oh, well, what's in it? And I said, oh, it's the Jack Daniel's, blah, blah, blah. And I mean, immediate energy shift. I cannot have that. I'm an alcoholic. Hard line, total boundary. And it was crystal clear, like to the point where I didn't even feel comfortable going like, I mean, it's been cooked, like the alcohol is gone. Like, I would have said to someone else, but very clear about boundaries. We need that, right? We need things that we can put in place that communicate to people very sternly where our limits are, and that we are unwilling to engage for one reason or another. What we are not trying to do with boundaries is put ourselves in a position where we're not learning, which is what I think I see sometimes. So there's a tool. Click down into the show notes. You can download it. That way you can save it or print it and reference it whenever you need it, stick it on your computer, whatever you want to do. But in the meantime, though, please remember, boundaries are an important tool, but they're just one tool, super powerful tool, but it's not the only tool that we have and the only one that, we will use for everything. If you are kind of finding yourself listening to this and going, oh, wait, maybe I'm not doing boundaries right, which is normal. Okay. I encounter this a lot. Here are some things that you can consider and some behaviors that you can watch for. I'm going to give you 2. So the first one is, if you are a person who tends to overgive, and so you attract people who may drain your time or energy, write down who or what feels draining. Like take a moment and write that down. You're an overgiver, but write down who it is or what it is that feels really draining. And if you can, identify the why. Like, why is this so draining? And then once you do that, define some boundaries for yourself around that. So like now you have all the detail. Now you can define a boundary around it. So it might sound something like, I have to have a boundary around how much I give so that I can make sure that I am okay first. Okay. So for example, if you are realizing that you give so much, and what feels draining is that you don't have enough for you, that gives you guidance. Okay, I have a boundary around how much I give so that I can make sure I am okay first. And you never have to really tell anyone that boundary. You can just operate within it. Okay. This is the way that I behave. This is the boundary I have set for myself. And you will need to action on it for it to work. And if you need support with that, lean into your friends, partners, therapists, etc. But if you think you can do it on your own, you don't ever have to mention it. You can just execute on it. Okay. So that's the first one. The second one, in terms of behaviors that I see that you should kind of keep an eye out for if you're a boundary struggler, you tend to end relationships like really quickly when someone crosses a perceived boundary, a boundary that you feel like you have. The first thing you want to do is assess, did you communicate the boundary? What did that sound like? When did you do that? Okay. Is there a clear point where you know you have communicated that this is a boundary? And then the second thing is having a conversation a better approach, or are you cutting someone off to avoid doing the labor that, quality connections require? Like, is there another way to handle this? Evaluate that really critically. And then you can set a boundary around this behavior, which could sound a little bit like, I will make sure that I responsibly communicate my concerns instead of cutting people off. My boundary is that I am not just going to cut folks off. I'm going to make sure I do the labor first. Just a couple things to keep in mind around boundaries. This is a super layered, nuanced topic, but I wanted to make sure we at least had some baseline guidance and tools, because at the end of the day, humaning well starts with us. We have to do the labor to give shape to the world around us, for us to get to the places that we want to be and be the people we want to be when we get there. We have to do the work, including setting the boundaries and doing it well. And it's worth the work. Like, we get a say in our experience here, right? So let's take advantage of it. All right, that's the episode. Thanks for tuning in. Please don't forget to click down into the show notes and get your free download, and I'll see you next week.